The senator from Missouri.
Madam President, I want to talk a little about regulation today. We end this Congress failing once again for the Congress to take more responsibility for regulation, things like the REINS Act that I co-sponsored with Rand Paul, Senator Paul, and others that would require members of Congress to vote on regulations that had significant economic impact, didn't get done. A bill that I introduced with Senator King from Maine that would create a regulatory review process that got great reviews in every economic and many other papers and magazines, didn't get done. But what I'm seeing in Missouri and around the country is more and more concern that begins to focus on the Congress of the United States not doing what it needs to do to keep the regulators under control. Legislation that would routinely put an end date on every regulation so that regulation has to be reviewed. Regulation has to come up again and be looked at. And frankly, if you combine that with the requirement for the Senate of the United States and the House to vote on that regulation, it'd be very unlikely that regulations that no longer made sense would be presented another time. So having to look at this in a way that makes sense for our economy. One of the generally used estimates is that $2 trillion worth, $2 trillion is spent every year in the United States complying with regulations. Well, let's assume that maybe as much as half of that, and it could be more, is either duplicative or just simply unnecessary. What would happen in our economy if we had $1 trillion chasing the future rather than trying to needlessly comply with things that no longer make sense? We have to take more responsibility for that because, frankly, there's no other way to get your hands on the regulators. The regulators are often out of control and almost always unaccountable. And frankly, Madam President, they're more unaccountable in the second term of a president than they are the first term because nobody in the chain of command ever has to go back and answer to the people we work for about the cost of these regulations. I know in my state, in Missouri, people are really concerned about a couple of regulations out there now. I think maybe that are dealing with energy policy and water policy, regulations that the EPA have opposed that just really don't make sense when you look at the cost of those regulations versus what would be gained by the regulations if they were even possible to comply with. I think a clear message was sent in November to the next Congress that people want the government to be more responsive, that people want the government to, when you have a cost-benefit analysis of something the government has done, make it a realistic analysis. Make it an analysis that would stand the straight-face test. That when you say, oh, this is not the emotional cost of worrying about some societal problem that you really can't quite define, this is what it really cost American families in terms of, for instance, their utility bill. We look at these regulations that frankly go beyond the capacity of the regulators. I'm not suggesting that the Congress of the United States is the right place to draft most regulations. And I'd say that the process of passing a law and saying we want this agency to figure out how to implement the law is in fact the right way to do that. But I'd also suggest that then that agency having to come back to the Congress and say, here's the regulation that we think is the proper implementation. Now you have to vote yes or no. This regulation is the way to go forward with this law. I think often the regulators now are well beyond what the law allows them to do. There's a case in point I'm going to talk about in a minute, the water rule that's out there where navigable water was used as a definition of where the EPA had some jurisdiction. Well, I think their view right now is well beyond navigable. So what would we do about that? I think the Enforce the Law Act that I introduced in the Senate, that the House passed months ago with a bipartisan vote, where the Congress would have standing in court to be able to go to court if either House of the Congress thought the president wasn't enforcing the law as intended, that the Congress, who now can't go to court and say, we want a third party to step in right now and define this principle, could go to court and say, we want to know right now what navigable meant in 1972 when it was put into law in the early 70s, what it meant in 1899 when it was used for the first time, and what it means today. There's no reason to have a couple of years of trying to comply with a regulation that eventually the Supreme Court will say, as they did a handful of times last year, that the federal government does not have jurisdiction to do this, or that people were appointed illegally to a board or commission, and that all of the actions they took had to be set aside. This is not a hypothetical case. This is what the court decided just last year. The Enforce the Law Act would give us the capacity to not require a citizen to have to bear the burden of looking at a regulation that's outside the law or doesn't make sense, but allow the Congress to actually participate in that process at a much earlier time. So I hope in the next Congress we'll do in the Senate what the House did and pass something like the Enforce the Law Act. I certainly intend to introduce that legislation again, put it on the president's desk, and have that discussion. The administration recently took the opportunity to roll out a new rule on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. This was a estimate of, this was a rule on air matter, ozone, a new ozone rule. Came out the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. Believe me, if you have a rule you think people are going to like, you don't put it out the Wednesday afternoon before Thanksgiving. This is always, watch late Friday afternoon what comes out, because that's what whoever is announcing it didn't want to announce on Monday. Or look at even a bigger day is the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, and we have a air rule now that we haven't achieved. We've made great strides in the right direction, but looking at where we are now on this rule, mercury in the air, quality of the air, that we'd have to have at least 85% attainment in counties all over America before you could then raise the bar one more time. This would take the 75% standard or 75 standard that we have now for particulate matter, the so-called NAAQS standard, and reduce it even further. Well, we're not in attainment with the first rule yet. And in fact, EPA just recently, years after the rule, put out the guidelines you'd need that were helpful to try to achieve the rule. Well, as soon as you get the guidelines for the last rule, the EPA wants to say, oh, and here's we want to talk about the next rule. Even though we just now told you how to begin to think about complying with the last rule, even though there are non-attainment areas all over the country, we want to move right beyond that and go to the next rule. That's the kind of thing that shouldn't be allowed to happen. People are still looking for good paying jobs. They're still looking at a utility bill. They want to make sense. And I hope the Congress can be part of that. The EPA has another rule that they've been asking for comment on, the so-called Clean Power Plan. Well, now, who's opposed to that? Nobody. There is nobody who doesn't want clean power. And in fact, the standards for utility power plants have moved in a very positive direction in the last 10 years. We've made great gains. And then the question is, are the next gains worth the economic cost? If the next gains are worth people having utility bills they can't pay, or if the next gains are worth people not having jobs that they would otherwise have, that's the discussion we need to have. The wrong utility policies produce an absolute lose-lose. The utility bill goes up, we lose jobs that we otherwise would have, and they go to places that care a whole lot about what comes out, less about what comes out of the smokestack than we do. So the problem gets bigger, we lose jobs, and the country that's made the most positive strides in recent years is the country that pays the price for rules that no longer make sense. The rule that's out now, our state's largely coal dependent. We're the 5th most coal dependent state. We're about 82% coal dependent. Of the million comments that have been made on the rule, 305,000 of them came from Missouri families. But there are 1 million comments of people talking about why this rule doesn't make sense for them. We need to be sure that we do the things that not only meet the legal standard, but also meet the common sense standard as we move forward. The Wall Street Journal recently ran an op-ed, an opinion editorial piece by Harvard professor Lawrence Tribe, who happened to be one of President Obama's law school professors, who's more often a witness for the left side of an argument than the right side of an argument. He joined the world's largest private coal company, Peabody Energy, to criticize the executive overreach in what the EPA is proposing as they propose to regulate carbon emissions from existing power plants. Now, Madam President, there's a big difference if you have a rule that talks about what you do in the future for utility companies than regulating what people have previously decided to do under the old rules. There's a bill out there that I'm a co-sponsor of that really tries to use the great resource we have through coal in a most effective way. But we don't produce any coal in Missouri anymore. We used to. We don't have any coal mines left in our state, but we have coal fueled power plants. It's not really a war on coal as far as Missourians are concerned. It's a war on coal-fired plants. And if you built a plant under the old rules, and it in fact has better air quality than any power plant has ever had up until this time, as all our recent plants have had, and you've still got life in that plant, but the EPA comes in and says, now you have to meet another standard with the plant you just built or you built 5 years ago, somebody has to pay that bill. And there's this mythical view that it's the big industry or it's manufacturing or it's the funniest, the most laughable of all is somehow the utility companies are going to pay the bill. The utility companies don't pay the bill. People that get a utility bill pay the bill. And the people that are most impacted by that are the people who are having a hard time paying their utility bill now. These are bad policies. I'm committed that as a Congress, we should do more than we've been doing to accept responsibility for these agencies that we fund, for some overall law that no matter how much they're abusing it by stretching it beyond what the Congress intended, the Congress would have passed. Nobody is out there issuing a rule and says, by the way, we don't have any legal authority to do this. So defining that authority, being sure the rules make sense are important. On the power, the power rule on December the 2nd, I filed comments urging that this rule be withdrawn and we think more carefully about the impact it has on jobs that have good take-home pay and on families that have a hard time paying their utility bill now, or retired individuals, or single moms, or others that have a hard time paying their utility bill now. We need to continue to look at that. One other rule I want to talk about as my time comes to a conclusion here is the so-called Waters of the United States rule. And the EPA was given the authority under the Clean Water Act, as I said earlier, to have some authority over navigable water. And navigable water, beginning in the 1890s, was used in federal law as a constitutional explanation of why the federal government would be involved in water policy. because the federal government under the Constitution is involved in commerce. Navigable and commerce come together. Navigable actually means you can navigate with some sort of vessel that can carry a commercial load. Well, the EPA has now decided, or in the process of proposing at least, that navigable water means any water that could run into any water, that could run into any water, that could be navigable. I am confident that's not what the Congress intended. Now, if they want to propose that, that's fine. The EPA, through the president, through the administration, can come to Congress and say, we think we ought to control all the water everywhere. Let's have a debate about that. And the Congress would not give the EPA that authority. So, Madam President, I just hope that the next Congress sets as a priority taking responsibility for what the federal government does. Taking responsibility for these regulators and regulations, being sure that we have regulations where we need them that make sense, and that we push back and don't have regulations where all they do is hurt families, hurt jobs, and don't solve the bigger problem. So I hope we see that happen, and I am hopeful that the next Congress is more focused on doing that job than this Congress was.